and a password will be circulated to you after the webinar. Within a certain period, we will get that to you. Also, it is critical for those who do not require CPD points that we will give you a general attendance of a certificate of attendance. And at this point, I'm going to now hand over to Mr. Norman Khoza, who, as part of the partnership between the National Institute for Occupational Health, we are running this webinar in partnership with SAIOH, and I hand over to Mr. Khoza in order to just do the introduction and a brief overview. Norman, are you available? Are you online?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. You may prefer to keep your video on or off. That's fine. I'm handing over to you. Thank you, Norman.
Thank you very much, Ashraf. Let me share my slide.
Ashraf, may you please maybe read his bio as he's trying to share? Please go ahead.
Okay. So just to read Norman's bio, one moment. I seem to, okay, here it is. Mr. Norman Khoza is an occupational hygiene professional born in South Africa with more than 15 years of experience in the occupational health and safety in Southern Africa, specifically on government, research institutions, consulting, parastatal and international organization in Africa. Norman is a senior program officer for occupational health and safety specialist at the UADA and NEPAD, that's the African Union Development Agency, and New Partnership for Africa's Development Agency. Mr. Khoza holds a master's in public health, and that is specifically occupational health and environmental health. The 2020 president of the Southern African Institute for Occupational Hygiene, SAIOH, and Mr. Khoza is a technical member of the RSA, National Department of Employment and Labor's Noise-Induced Hearing Loss Regulations Review Technical Working Group, appointed by the Chief Inspector of the Department of Employment and Labor. And Norman is a member and technical advisor of the NIOH COVID-19 NIOH Expert Working Group in response to the scourge of the COVID-19 in workplaces. Mr. Khoza is currently living in Midrand, South Africa, with his lovely one wife, Lucith, and three boys, Duzi, Kenzo, and Kani Khoza. So welcome. Thank you very much again for making the time and this partnership with the NIOH. I hand over to you, Norman. Please proceed.
Thank you, Ashraf, and welcome to our panelists and presenters, and as well as our participants as well. Today, actually, I think it marks a very interesting day where we are starting, a new partnership with different stakeholders in terms of addressing some of the challenges that we're facing right now due to COVID-19. But today, I think I will look at the implication of using public masks also, mask concerns. We are looking at issues like the efficacy concerns that are surrounding it.
Norman, apologies for interrupting. Could you just maximize your slide, please?
I think I did that.
I think it's the little screen icon at the bottom of the frame of the box. Bottom right corner.
It's the one that looks like a wine goblet, if you're that way inclined.
Thanks, Prof. Rees.
Yeah, mine, I think, okay, let me out. Is it okay now?
We now see your notes as well. Glenn, if you could just assist.
My apologies.
Hi, Norman. Are you using two screens or is one screen?
Yeah, I was using two screens.
Okay.
Should I connect the two screens?
No, like it's fine if you're using one. You can close this one. Top right corner there.
On this one.
Just close it. Go back to the original page for PowerPoint.
Like when you say I should minimize it.
You can close it. Just close it. Just close the one that opened now, because we can see the next slide and the one that is supposed to present. It's supposed to be one in full.
Click the X across at the top where your cursor is.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay.
And then you can maximize, go to top right corner, then you can maximize this one. Yes, it's fine now.
It's fine now. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. My apologies, colleagues. Technology sometimes, yeah. So we are talking, Mark, we've got a number of experts here who will be assisting us moving forward in the collaboration between the two institutions and other partners as well. And we are looking, the PPE, and I think we know in the world of occupational safety that PPE or, masks are last resort, but also they are very important in exposure control mechanism. I think some of the things that we will discuss today with regards to the difference between surgical masks, fabric masks, and also those with them. We will also look at the difference between, workplace and public, because these masks actually are sort of like, discussed in that space. We need to differentiate, those areas, because, for example, me, I'm working here at NIOH, I'm sitting in my office, and I think, where I'm sitting, actually, exposure level is not the same as in the hospital setting. I think we need to define and draw lines in those areas. We also need to acknowledge also that, these fabric masks, actually, they provide sort of like a limited, protection in terms of COVID-19, even if sometimes can be a placebo effect. But I think, we need to acknowledge that, introducing these, they are going forward. So the experts that are here, they will be assisting us in terms of making sure that we define, those parameters, those areas, in terms of making sure that we understand what we are dealing with, and also address the questions. What we know currently is that in different countries, and especially countries that did not use masks, and also the ones that use masks, actually, there was a greater benefit in the countries actually that use masks in terms of controlling the scourge of COVID-19. And I think that's where the research actually that informed the TTIC to come up with the technical guide on how we can develop these masks. And I think they are here to assist us understand those parameters moving forward as well. But the questions that will be discussed as well, that will be led by Prof. Kev today, is the purpose of fabric masks as well, the selection process that we need to follow, and how to maintain, these fabric and fabric masks, and cloth as well. How are they efficient in terms of curbing COVID-19 moving forward? And the limitations, there are limitations as well. I think we'll look at those areas. As we are going on, presentations, I think you have to look at that moving forward. But I think the key issue for this webinar for me is the collaboration, because we're working with NIOH, but also we're working with partners moving forward. Because if I sit somewhere and say, discussing the issues of fabric masks is not NIOH, it's not in SAIOH problem, I think I'll be making a wrong, judgment as well. And again, the public as well, or DTIC, not to come and discuss with us, the ideas in terms of, the fabric masks as well. I think it will be different. It will not be helping as well. So in these, that's why we are coming here to come and discuss, to make sure that we discuss issues actually that can come together. Because a person who's sitting in the workplace is the same person who's also a public person as well. So we need to look at that. I put pictures here in terms of, trying to zoom out, the issues of collaboration. For example, you can't sit in a boat that has got a leak and sitting at the corner and say, no, I won't do anything because the leak is not on my side, because eventually all of us as a country will go down. So we need to look at that as well. The risk actually is greater if you are using a wrong respirator as well. I think that is the message that we're trying to proclaim. We understand that, you know, the PPE has become fashionable, and sometimes you're baffled, you know, you're baffled about what is happening. If you look at that picture, you know, and how it looks, and look at that as well, this is what's happening actually currently in the world in terms of the PPE. And you can be surprised, you know, in terms of whether it's effective or not effective. PPE has never been a fashion, but through collaboration, I think we can make these fashionable and also provide, you know, adequate protection as well. Therefore, it's important for all of us to work together and come up with innovative ways, universities, research, academic, you know, institution research as well, and also companies as well, to come work together, and government, to make sure that we come with innovative ideas, to make sure that we produce something that will provide adequate protection. And lastly, let me thank these different, you know, organizations that allowed their experts to come and assist us in terms of addressing some of the issues that are coming. And I think they are here, all of them. I won't mention them by name, but I understand that they're all here and they are panelists, some are presenting. So thank you very much, Ashraf. I think we can go on with the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was Dr. Norman Khoza on behalf of the partner organization that we are working with, and that is SAIOH, the South African Institute for Occupational Hygiene. And just as Norman has mentioned, we've got quite a significant group of presenters. Our next presenter will be Professor David Rees, followed by Mr. Mahendra Shunmugam, and then Professor Badenhorst, that is Cass Badenhorst. We also have quite a number of very good panelists that will be joining us, which Professor Badenhorst will be hosting the Q&A session on high-level recommendations that may come out of that session. And we will have Mr. Garth Hunter, again, Professor Jan du Plessis, Professor David Rees, Mr. Sean Chester, again, Mr. Shunmugam, and Dr. Greg Q joining us for that Q&A session. So thanks again for that, Norman. I am just reminding everybody that this particular recording, video and audio, will be shared on the NIOH website. That is www.nih.ac.za, www.nih.ac.za. And I highly recommend that you visit our website. It contains a lot of important resources and previous webinars that we've undertaken since March, and that website is 0 rated. I'm now going to hand over to Professor David Rees, and it is with great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Rees. He's one of the colleagues here at the NIOH that I've met before I started this job, and it's always a very great pleasure to engage with him and be advised by him on the matters of occupational health. Professor Rees is the head of occupational medicine and epidemiology here at the National Institute for Occupational Health, and is emeritus professor at Wits University. There's much more I want to say, but I think Professor Rees wanted to keep it short. I hand over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Ashraf, and good morning, everybody, and thanks for the opportunity. Is the screen share working?
Yes, thank you, Prof.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the changing perceptions about the value of cloth masks during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. And just to stress, I'm not talking about surgical masks, that's a different animal. Oh, how do I move these along? Sorry, I can't move this along. What am I supposed to do? Okay.
Yeah.
Right, we got it. So I think one of the things I learned during the change in perceptions is that maybe in new situations, unlearning can be as important as learning. And I say this because at the start of the epidemic, I thought cloth masks were a lot of rubbish, to be honest. I wouldn't have supported their use by anybody. And my view was partly informed by two research projects I'd been involved in. The research projects were on N95 filtering facepiece respirators, but nevertheless, they were pertinent in my mind to cloth masks. Both these studies were initiated and led by Janeth Manganye. This is the first one. So it looked at quantitative respirator fit. So in other words, using objective measures to see how well respirators fitted people. And this study was done on laboratory respirator users who are professional respirator wearers and well trained in their use. And the extraordinary finding was that 98% of these respirator users failed the fit test. In other words, they weren't getting adequate fit from their N95 respirators. The second study was on the effect on fit of multiple consecutive donning and doffing, in other words, putting on and taking off of these N95 respirators. So people put on the respirator 6 times and took them off 6 times. And after each donning, putting them on, they were fit tested. And 48% of these study subjects, also trained in the use of respirators, failed at least one fit test after redonning. It was probably a consequence of lax adherence to proper donning techniques. In other words, not failure of tethering components. But nevertheless, these two studies really left me with the impression that if professional trained wearers of proper respirators can't get adequate protection, what chance, what hope for cloth masks? There was also the question of the safety of fabric masks. And at the start of the epidemic, there were some people who were pretty vehement about the fact that they would do more harm than good. And there were 3 main concerns. The one was increased risk of infection to the wearer. So there was this worry about contamination. You know how people fiddle with their masks while they're wearing them. They touch things, touch their mask, touch their face. And also that when the mask got damp because of breathing through them, they would increase the risk of infection. I think the main concern actually was the increased risk to other people because people wearing masks would have a false sense of security and wouldn't carry out all the other things they're supposed to do, like social distancing. And also there was a very strong sense that in an untrained community, people wouldn't wear the masks properly. I mean, you know, like letting their nose stick out, for instance. So we've all seen stuff like this, except maybe not so much the airport setting. I don't know about you, I haven't been into an airport for a long time. But certainly, I think most of us have come across congregate settings where there are lots of people on top of each other wearing masks and not social distancing. And you know, I'm sure all of you have been into supermarkets and shook your head looking at what people are doing, taking off their masks to talk to people, fiddling with their eyes, fiddling with their noses. In fact, I once saw a person take off his mask to have a jolly good cough. You know, after all, you don't want to mess up your mask, do you? So I think there was a prevailing view that cloth masks would achieve little or nothing. They wouldn't be good at reducing transmission. They may increase risk, and there wouldn't be any benefit to the wearer. But these negative perceptions changed quite quickly during the pandemic. There were many reasons for the change in perception, but I think these 2 impactful ones I want to mention. And Norman Kosa has already mentioned one of them. Countries with a high pre-pandemic mask use and then extensive uptake when the pandemic started had relatively small epidemics. And also, there have been some laboratory studies of cloth masks showing reduced dispersion of droplets. So I want to just briefly mention those two things. So the part of the world where this ecological evidence came from, because these are sort of population-based evidence of populations, which is called ecological evidence, were mostly in this part of Asia, so Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, Vietnam, Singapore, countries like that. Despite the fact that they have big populations living on top of each other in crowded circumstances, they had, relatively small epidemics. And I think most of you will know, if you've traveled to that part of the world, that wearing masks is commonplace. I mean, if you walk down the street, quite a large proportion of people are wearing masks even before the epidemic. I think it's important to bear in mind that in these countries, it wasn't only that they wore masks, there were many other interventions. For example, in South Korea, they had a rigorous contact tracing and isolation intervention, which is probably more important than wearing masks, but it's very hard to tell what proportion each intervention makes. But at the end of this ecological evidence, it suggests two things. The one is that there's potential benefit from wearing cloth masks. And the other is that they're probably safe to wear, that they don't increase the risk of infection materially, because if they had done, surely the epidemics in those countries wouldn't have been so small. There have been a lot of laboratory-based studies on the plume of droplets that occur while wearing masks. This one by Vaola, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it. I think many of you might have read, because it sort of went viral in South Africa, if you'll excuse the pun. So what this picture shows, it was done from Scotland, by the way. What this picture shows is that following a cough, wearing a cloth mask contains the forward spread of the droplets pretty effectively. What it doesn't do is contain the dispersion of the droplets at the back of the wearer's head, which makes sense, of course, because you'd expect the air to take the path of least resistance, which would be over the person's cheeks and out the back of the mask to behind them. But I mean, this and similar studies have shown containment of droplets. So if you're standing in front of somebody, if they're wearing a mask and they cough, you're probably pretty much protected as long as you're a reasonable distance away. But the message to many of us was, be careful standing behind mask wearers in a queue, for instance. So as a consequence of these bits of evidence and other evidence, wearing cloth masks, recommendations for wearing them became commonplace. In fact, it became a mantra, part of the wash your hands, wear a mask, keep your distance. And this is despite the fact that there's no real direct evidence of their value. This is based on the indirect evidence, two pieces of which I've presented. So there's no direct evidence from community trials, for instance. Of course, doing community trials would be difficult if you think about it. You would have to compare, let's say you would have to identify a community, part of which wears masks and part of which doesn't, and they would need to be the same sort of socio-demographics, etc. And then you would have to compare infection rates in the mask wearers and the non-mask wearers. And you could do that, but the problem is you will probably have confounding. In other words, it's likely that people who wear masks would also be more likely to partake in other interventions like social distancing. So it might be quite difficult to measure the effect of masks wearing directly. But in any event, there may not have been trials and direct evidence, but there's quite a lot of expert opinion published. And this is a recent review on the wearing of cloth masks. And they came to the conclusion after looking at all the evidence that they are effective for source control. In other words, they stop people who are infected spreading it in areas of high transmission and in a widespread pandemic. And of course, that makes sense. You're not going to have much effect of preventing spread by having everybody wear masks if hardly anybody's infected. And this view, to a large extent, is supported by the latest World Health Organization guide on cloth or fabric masks. I think it's the latest. It's the one published in June 2020. I haven't come across another one, but these guides come out one on top of each other, so there might be a later one, but I don't think so. And basically, they said that they are not yet supported by high quality or direct scientific evidence. But it's important to note that in this guide, there's a table, table 2, which identifies high risk settings where they suggest that wearing masks is necessary and will be effective. One of those situations is public transport. And since many workers use public transport, it's an important thing for us to consider. So now my sense about this is, there's no direct high quality evidence that cloth or fabric masks add great value to epidemic control. But the indirect evidence, which is quite persuasive, does suggest that we should take a precautionary approach. It's sensible to take a precautionary approach, and it's sensible to recommend the use of cloth masks, particularly in the height of epidemics where a lot of people are potentially infected. So the recommendation is now commonplace, but there's still many unanswered questions. And two of them that I want to very briefly consider are these. Do cloth masks increase the risk of infection in some settings? And is the wearer protected? And this issue of the wearer being protected it's not only about the fact that it would be important if the wearer is protected, but also because it makes the messaging about wearing masks potentially better. At the moment, the messaging relies a lot on altruism. In other words, you wear your mask for me, I wear my mask for you. And as we know, not everybody is moved by altruism. So I think the messaging would be stronger if we could say, sure, you're wearing the mask for me and I wear mine for you, but you're also wearing yours for you. I think the messaging would be stronger if it were framed like that. So are there settings in which cloth masks have been shown to be a risk for the wearer? There are not many studies on this, but this is a well-known one. In fact, it was done before the COVID-19 epidemic. It was published in 2015. And it's a trial, a randomized trial. So what they did, this is in healthcare, in the healthcare setting. It was done in a number of clinics and hospitals. What they did was they had 3 arms to this trial. The one arm was healthcare workers who were issued cloth masks, 6 of them, told how to wear them, taught how to wear them, taught how to wash them, etc. The second arm was health workers issued with surgical masks, and the third arm were health workers left to their own devices. So they just carried on doing what they had been doing before the trial started. And very interestingly, there was an increased risk of infection in cloth mask wearers. This is respiratory infections, compared to the controls and the surgical mask wearers. So there was an increased risk of infection in cloth mask wearers. and they, the authors recommended that healthcare workers shouldn't wear cloth masks. Now, I don't think any of us would ever have recommended that healthcare workers wear cloth masks. But apparently in Asia, when there's a real scarcity of surgical masks, this has been a measure of control. But I think the big question from this study is, does this increased risk extend to other occupational groups? And I think it might extend to other occupational groups where there's a high probability of contact with a highly infectious person. But I've been trying to think what those settings might be, and I can't. Maybe some of you will be able to let us know what you think about that. Is the wearer protected? Well, again, there's scant research about this. And again, one would have to, these studies would be difficult, as I said before, because confounding would be quite likely. So there haven't been community trials or trials in occupational settings done about protecting people, but there have been some quite persuasive perspectives or commentaries. I think this is an important one. It's worth reading, I think, for those of you who have an interest in it. So essentially what this perspective presented was evidence. This is both animal experiments and human experiments, not COVID-19 and not direct evidence, but a synthesis of indirect evidence that low dose exposure, because you're wearing a protective device like a cloth mask, or reduced dose of the virus, reduced inoculum, would lead to less severe and more asymptomatic infections. And of course, this hasn't been proven, but it has face validity. I mean, we know this from other infections. For example, GRT infections. If you go to a dinner party and the prawns are a bit off, and you have one prawn and somebody else has 10 prawns, the person who has the 10 prawns is more likely to get a GRT infection than the person who has one. So this has face validity to me, and I'd be interested to see what the evolving evidence is going to be about this. But I think these excerpts from two recent documents give the prevailing view about protection to the wearer. So the top one is the European Journal of Medical Research. And basically they conclude that masks for everyday use can have a small protective effect for the wearer. Now I've read the article, and I must say I don't know where they get this from, because it seems to be just an opinion. The June WHO guidance is a bit more direct in saying that there's no evidence of protection of the wearer. So my conclusion about protection of the wearer, I've done a rather superficial review of the literature. You know, it takes a long time to do a proper review, but nevertheless, it's going to depend on the mask and the wearer. I mean, there are different masks and there are different ways of wearing them. It isn't easy to find quality evidence that there's substantial protection of the wearer, but on the other hand, it's equally hard to find evidence that there's no protection. And I think that mask fabrics and practices are improving, and the evidence will evolve, and we shouldn't close our minds to a protective effect. So I wanted to conclude by saying, well, at least on this issue, I'll keep an open mind and wear mine, but then I remember that I don't wear cloth masks. I wear surgical masks. I think they're better. Obviously, in times of scarcity, surgical masks should be reserved for high-risk populations. But I don't know that there's still scarcity. Certainly, there's not a scarcity of surgical masks in Johannesburg. You can find them virtually anywhere. But certainly there are going to be settings where there's scarcity, and then cloth masks become important again. So I just want to finish by saying, I think it's important for me, a message to me, not to be too rigid, and remember that unlearning in new situations can be as important as learning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Professor David Rees, Emeritus Professor David Rees, as well as the head of the Occupational Medicine and Epidemiology here at the NIOH. Thank you, Prof, for your contribution. I think that was a very useful and setting the scene given the changing environment around the use of cloth masks, as well as the serious considerations for occupational settings where employees may be at risk, as you've exposed. Thank you for that. The next presenter is Mr. Mahendra Shanmugam. And the topic that Mahendra will be dealing with is the DTIC recommended guidelines for fabric face masks in South Africa, the function, properties, and general use guide with regard to this. So I'm going to encourage you to share your screen and to unmute your microphone. Mr. Mahendra Shanmugam is the Director of Policy Implementation of the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, that's the DTIC. His responsibilities at the DTIC includes implementation of the clothing, textile, footwear and leather master plan, working with stakeholders to align with the industry policy of the Republic of South Africa and to implementing sustainable economic growth and development policies. Mahendra's previous professional experience includes working in economic policy development implementation at the US's National Academy of Sciences in Washington, D.C., international trade and climate change policy at the Wuppertal Institute in Berlin, Germany, and foreign policy at the Department of International Relations and Cooperation in Pretoria, that's DIRCO, and for the Chevron Corporation and Johnson & Johnson. Mahendra is also a recipient of the prestigious OMT Scholarship and DIRCO graduate funding. He holds a Bachelor of Social Sciences from the University of Cape Town, a BA Honours from the University of Pretoria, and a Master of Public Policy, that is economic policy focused, from the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, Germany. So thank you very much for joining us and sharing with us your presentation today. I hand over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Hope you can hear me well. And thank you for affording us the opportunity to present on the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, as our new name in the 6th administration, the guidelines that we had developed in the fabric face mask for our Republic. I'm briefly going to go through the presentation, just giving you the rationale for our guidelines, the functionality and properties we had reviewed, some of David's academic journals and research that he had indicated in his presentation, and the assumption base that we had taken to prepare this guidelines and why it was published and the community setting we had in mind. So early on in the pandemic set in March, we had evaluated that the Republic of South Africa's PPE was not going to be sufficient, especially as David had indicated in the demand for the surgical masks and respirators were increasing as any kind of information regarding the COVID-19 virus spreading and the pandemic that was engulfing our global communities and what precautions we needed to be taken. The National Command Center, in collaboration with our social partners, including the unions, were aware that some of the frontline workers were going to be impacted if there was going to be a rush to the market to go and purchase these limited supply of surgical masks and respirators. The Department of Trade and Industry took it upon themselves to then appoint myself and the social partners to do a review of what was being conducted globally. And we then, this was in the early March, just as we had went into lockdown level 5, we then looked at some of the other countries' precautionary guides, We had looked at what was being done in the environment where borders were also being shut. We looked at some of the academic journals to the efficiency and the use of cloth masks. Remember, at the point the cloth mask we used was at the Spanish flu time, and we then looked at the quality of textiles and what would be required for droplet filtration, penetration to be reduced, and the health risk mitigation factors. So here we consulted with the University of Stellenbosch's medical textiles facility and the Cape Peninsula University of Technology's fabric department. In our research and the health risk mitigation, the assumption was that the person who is wearing the cloth mask or fabric mask was going to be COVID-19 positive. And the wearing of the mask was to prevent the droplets escaping from the person who is wearing it onto a potentially COVID-19 negative person in the general public. When we had reviewed the information that was available, we had noticed that, you know, the cloth mask was not a one-stop health risk mitigation option. It was to be used in conjunction with the other health mitigation protocols, such as the 1.5 physical distancing, the regular washing and use of sanitizers, not going out into public without wearing a mask, or staying at home and not being in general public at all. We had also looked at, when the use of cloth masks, how would someone be able to store that, the handling of it, the basic water and sanitation that was required regarding our demographic and the access to water and sanitation in some areas of the country, and whether a cloth mask, you know, the properties of using a cloth mask on multiple occasions. So the DTI then recommended that whenever a cloth mask was sold, it was going to have to be specific markings on the package so that they could be the appropriate size and the fit. So the health protocols were meant to be ensured. That means when you're washing it, to wash it with hot water and soap and allow it to dry. It should be able to be washed 100 times if it was cloth. It must also be the fit and form comfort of the person wearing it. And the research on the person wearing it from being as a preventative mechanism from getting COVID-19, we had not at the time in March had seen any of this information, as David has alluded to, that is now coming about in terms of some of the studies, that there is a preventative mechanism within a cloth mask if the wearer is wearing it. With regards to the efficiency of the fabric, we then, remember, our borders were closed at this time, and as David said as well in the presentation, there was a shortage of surgical masks, and we needed to make sure that the frontline workers was going to have access to this. So we looked at the properties of a fabric, and similar to a surgical mask, and what would that need to be. And the Department of Trade and Industry published its guidelines with the requirement that it should be at least a 5-micron barrier efficiency. And while we didn't want tests to be conducted on the efficiency, we did do tests on the fabric available in the Republic. And we did put out guidelines that spoke to the types of fabric, the layering effect. So for example, the buffers, we did not stipulate clearly that those buffers should not be worn, but the buffers are predominantly made out of one layer of fabric, and there was a not very tight layer. So we did say that the layering effect of a cloth mask was necessary, with preferably a 3-layer cloth mask with a insert of a tightly woven fabric, such as those found in the inner lining of a suit, that will allow a preventative barrier from droplets escaping from the user. As I said, we had evaluated the fabric qualities within the Republic, and we found that we had sufficient and oversupply of fabric that could go into this. And in terms of the department's role, is that we were aware that many factories and workers would be impacted by an economic downturn, especially as our borders were shut. And we then asked many clothing manufacturers to start with the National Bargaining Council for the clothing sector to start preparing itself for the manufacture of cloth masks. And we evaluated that it would be necessary to publish a guideline so that those communities that were going to be making cloth masks in rural areas were given sufficient information that were able to protect them or potentially protect them from spreading the virus, and to be in a uniform guideline for our republic. We've also did at the beginning look at the valves, because we had consultations with industry at some point and also with the South African Bureau of Standards, and there was conversations of the valves being inserted. And when we updated the guidelines, the second round of guidelines, we didn't as a department include any of the valves, because we were aware that while it did give you a breathability and a better longevity of wearing your mask without touching it, the efficiency of the mask, as we had researched, was going to be compromised. So that valve allows for a opening of the fabric that's inserted to also the sustainability of that plastic device, and the filter that's inserted to sustain a washing or cleaning was also compromised, and therefore it would most probably allow for the spreading of the infection further. If you have been following the recent developments, you would notice the Center for Disease Control in the United States has recently, in the end of August, published a notice saying that these sort of masks do not provide any barrier for spreading the virus and should not be worn. The New Zealand Health Department, in my research, also saw that they have also recommended that no masks should be sold with valves. And the Department of Trade and Industry, in consultation with the Department of Health, is considering issuing a notice regarding fabric masks that are now being made with these valves, and also the fashion consciousness. So early on in the pandemic, with the Department of Health, we did issue some marketing material, as you would have seen on the various media platforms, on the use of masks, the care of masks, and what the masks were meant to be. As David said, there was no research conclusively saying that this could actually prevent the spread of the virus. But at the time, in the situation that we were in, we would rather have, and this was what the consideration is, that the Republic was better at issuing a directive that we wear masks, because pending the research, it was seen as the best option. And now I think we've still taken the position, and it is mandatory that you wear masks in public settings until COVID-19 vaccine is potentially found. Looking at the research also from the United States Academy of Sciences and many other institutions that have done some laboratory tests on the longevity of the virus sustaining itself on surfaces, it was seen that the cloth mask actually has other benefits from a person wearing it, because it doesn't allow the virus to be spread onto surfaces. It's controlled and contained within the fabric, and this was seen as a positive at the time. Yes, so I would be able to take some questions on this. I know that my presentation was quite brief, but we still, as the department and as government regulations, see the value in wearing of cloth masks. David is correct. We do have now, in regards to surgical masks, there is a lot of supply in the Republic. The Department of Trade and Industry, working with the Business for South Africa partnerships during the COVID lockdown levels, had also moved our energies to looking at the PPE production and localization efforts. As you would have seen, that we have now developed a ventilator. We've also moved much of our manufacturing capacity into surgical masks, and we have quite a few companies actually that have passed all the requirements in terms of the testing, the standardization. We also looked at the specifications as published by our sister agencies in the United States and in the European Union, and we homogenized many of that specifications to South African specifications and standards. And many factories was onboarded to now respond to this. And as our president said, we do have now capacity to meet the demand in the market in terms of PPE. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's Mahendra Shanmugam. the Director for Policy Implementation at the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, the DTIC. Thank you for your contribution. And he followed on Professor David Rees, the Head of Occupational Medicine and Epidemiology at the NIOH, that dealt with the previous topic. Our next presenter is Professor Cas Badenhorst. And Professor Badenhorst is going to deal with the Q&A address and high-level recommendations. I immediately hand over to you, Professor. And whilst Professor Badenhorst is busy preparing to share, I assume that you may be sharing something. Professor Badenhorst is the Group Lead Occupational Health at Anglo American PLC. He's a certified occupational hygienist working in the field of occupational health and hygiene for more than 20 years. He's appointed as an extraordinary associate professor in occupational health and hygiene at the Northwest University, and is an honorary fellow at the University of, I hope I'm pronouncing this properly, Wollongong in Australia. He's the past president of the Southern African Institute for Occupational Hygiene, SAIOH, and the current chair of the Health Working Group at the International Council of Mining and Metals, that's the ICMM. So thank you very much for joining us today. Part of the Q&A panel that Professor Badenhorst is going to chair for us is Mr. Garth Hunter, Professor Johan du Plessis, Professor David Rees, Mr. Sean Chester, Mr. Mahendra Shunmugam, and Dr. Greg Q. I hand over to you, Prof. Badenhorst.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Great to have so many participants on the call, and obviously this topic is of great interest and potentially great debate, not only for academics, but also for workplaces and for the country as a whole. Can I ask that if you do have a specific question, that we use the raise hand function, or that you drop a question for us in the Q&A box, just to try and organize how we answer that, and that we do get to everybody's question when possible. So I'm going to start off, and there's a number of hands raised, but let me ask an opening question. There was a question in the chat box around the wearing of masks and fitness facilities, gyms, and so forth. And the individual asked for opinion on wearing masks in gyms and what fitness industry and what should be done. What's the guidance from this group? So I'm going to hand over to my panelists. I'm not sure who wants to take the question and get us going on a response, specifically to wearing of masks when exercising and then in the gym setup.
This is Greg Q speaking. Thanks, Cas. I'm going to just throw in some. Can you hear me? Is the sound clear?
Yes, perfect.
I'll just have a quick comment on that. I think perhaps in settings of that nature, we're talking about people who are breathing heavily, who are generating high volume plumes through the exercise. Mask wearing will certainly be of benefit. Perhaps it is the wrong question though. In settings like that, the ventilation and the number of people on the floor perhaps shouldn't be excluded from the question. And so let me just make that point, that if you are in a gym setting, a sporting setting, if you're outdoors, then that's a good place to be. If you're indoors in a gym, which is obviously the nature of this question, then that gym must make sure that the ventilation and the spacing and the number of occupants enable adequate reduction of viral generation. So perhaps that's the first engineering answer to the question, and then thereafter, whatever mask you wear will perhaps play a slightly less important role, because that's really your most important. The masks then would have to be just comfortable and adequate to try and reduce the plume that you generate for the people around you. That's just the comment I want to make. I'm keen to hear what the others have to say.
Hi, Cass, it's Mahendra. Would you like me to interject at this point? Okay.
Please do. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just tell you what the government's position is that, and why also that we had restricted, firstly, the opening of gyms very early on, and then other public spaces, and now with the new protocols. So I was also involved in some of the workplace, back to work protocols for both the industry and also factory workers. And part of the discussions at that stage, this was around April, May, is that there were essential protocols that needed to be implemented before we could go to alert level 2 and 1, where economic activity would resume in major places. So in regards to fitness studios, we had requested that the ventilation system be replaced, that the air circulation should not be in a sort of the old system where they just recirculated the air. There had to be fresh air circulating. There's also the other protocols that has to be maintained. So for example, as the president had indicated in his address, the public spaces would have to ensure 50% of its capacity to be sealed off. So it only to be allowed 50% of the floor space that can allow for people. Then the protocols of the physical distance between the person exercising to the next person has to be ensured, so that you also have the 1.5 physical distance, and the regular sanitation and wiping down of all equipment before and after the use. So you have to ensure all those protocols. I do agree with Greg that it is still a very unknown territory, and the droplets and as you've seen in the retail spaces, when people go into there, the touching, and it's very hard to control and monitor that, and some places are not doing it. So yes, it is still going to be a very high risk. And I personally wouldn't recommend going into a space as a fitness studio.
Yes, there's no way that we can put up our hands, hey? But anyway, I just wanted to say, when I exercise, I find a cloth mask virtually intolerable, but a surgical mask not. So people who can get them and use them, I would advise that. Also, when you're in a gym, be careful how close you stand behind people, because the aerosols are being vented behind the people. It's much more effective in front of them.
Thank you, David. Whilst I've got you online, David, there's a question in the chat box that you indicated your response to live. So the benefit of the participants, the question is from Puleng Matele. I usually catch a cold each time after going jogging outdoors, but I have never caught not even the mildest one this year, since each time I've been wearing a cloth mask. I've been jogging wearing a cloth mask since the earliest time outdoor exercising was allowed during the lockdown. So how can I not believe this practice is proactive? David?
Yeah, it's a good point. There's been a very small flu and cold epidemic this year in South Africa and other parts of the world. But I think it's a consequence of all of the interventions together. So social distancing, the shutdown, less travel, less international travel, you know, because quite a lot of these infections are spread from one country to the other. So there have been a lot of interventions which have dampened down the epidemics of flus and colds. So you're not coming across people who could infect you. That's basically the reason. And of course, if you're outside, yeah, with a bit of ventilation, that's also very helpful. So look, as I said in my presentation, I think wearing masks based on the indirect evidence is useful, and I will continue to do so. And I wouldn't dispute that you haven't got some protection, but I think the major protection has come from all the other interventions which have just dampened down the epidemics.
Thank you, David. Let me move over to the questions from the floor of the hand raised. So if I call out your name, you can just unmute yourself and pose a question. I'll start from the top of my list. Elise van Jaarsveld, please.
Akas, perhaps could I ask a question or answer that question, which David's answered, or perhaps add to it?
Yeah, you can add to it. You're welcome.
So sure, in terms of then, if you look at the R value of the reproductive value, or the R attack rate of SARS-CoV-2 is about 5.7, influenza is about 1.4. And so if you look at then the controls in place, if you have the controls in place of COVID, you're largely going to prevent actually then the influenza, because influenza is actually, it's less easily passed on. The attack rate is actually lower, which means all the controls actually for COVID are actually going to then work for influenza. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we haven't actually then seen actually a huge actually number of actually influenza cases. Then second of all, just to add what Dr. Q was saying, is that if I just share my screen, there's just a single slide, is that I can't add it, is that if we look at then what the effectiveness of the relative contribution or the reduction actually in that R value that the different controls actually add, they're not equal. Typically, face coverings or fabric face coverings adds around 5 to 10% actually risk reductions, risk or reduce COVID infections by about that order. When you add then both then hand hygiene together with actually face masks, it adds about a 10 to 20% actually reduction in actually COVID-19 infections. In comparison, if you, depending on then the air changes per hour, if you're adding up to 12 air changes per hour, you've got about a 99.9% risk reduction. So if we're talking actually then within gym setting, the relative risk reduction achieved by wearing a fabric face mask is a very, very small contributor relative to the number of air changes per hour. And that's really what concerns me, is I went into a local mall, and being a hygienist for many years and actually then having actually tested CO2 levels, I can tell then that the number of air changes per hour, if it's stuffy, you've got less probably than 2 air changes per hour. And so malls that are stuffy and gyms that are stuffy, you've got way too, the ventilation rates are way too low. And so we are going to have infections. You can wear the mask all you like. You can practice hand hygiene, but if you haven't got your ventilation right, you haven't got the number of air changes per hour correct, you are going to have infections. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you for your contribution. Let me go to our live questions. Elise van Jaarsveld.
Thanks, Prof. My colleague Glenn is about to activate Elise's microphone for her.
Thank you
just to note that the panelists also have the facility now to raise their hands for you.
Thank you. Whilst we're waiting for Elise, there's a question that came up that I found quite interesting on the chat box, and would like opinions from the panelists. It's with regards to the use of buffs and other types of material as opposed to a cloth mask. There's been various discussions on how effective is a buff or a scarf, and should they be allowed similar to or be comparable to masks. Any takers of the panelists or any comments from the panel on that specific product or approach?
Hi, Cass, I'll give that a go. Sean Chester here.
Yeah, go for it, Sean.
I'm sure my esteemed colleagues will also have equal, if not better, responses than me. However, buffs and the whole thing with all these masks are relative to actually how much they can contain the forward projection. David was actually saying that it's an altruistic thing. So I noticed last night I went out to dinner to my local restaurant, so good to be open. And it's actually now just spread. When I see probably about 60% of the people that are in there have just got a buff around their neck. It's obviously become pretty fashionable now to actually have something like that and then put it over their mouths. I've done a few presentations on sort of an easy way to test whether your mask has got the ability to protect other people, because that's what it's all about. It's altruistic. It's not really protecting you. And the experiment that I do is basically putting a candle on and wearing whatever mask that I want to test and seeing if I can blow the candle out through the mask. And it doesn't matter if I take a buff layer to sort of 8 layers. So basically fold it in and over itself about 8 times. The candle is still pretty easy to blow out. So I think in that is my answer. Thanks, over.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes.
Just if I could add something on that study that which David Rees spoke about, which is I think it was actually in 14 or 15 hospitals actually in Hanoi, Vietnam, is that what was interesting about that study is that they found that the fabric masks used were 97% ineffective. So what that meant is when challenged against sodium chloride, a particle of 0.3 microns, that it only actually trapped 3% of those particles. And when you compare that against a 3-layer mask or other masks, other good masks, that's extremely, extremely ineffective. So that really gives us our answer is that those infections then were, I think, largely due to the ineffectiveness of actually the fabric masks. And so not all fabric masks are actually then made equal. And I think that that's a really important consideration. In addition to that, there's actually a really nice slide in one of the articles which Mahendra actually shared. And you can see that the massive variation actually between the different types of fabrics, where they put these fabrics under a microscope and then showed then the apertures actually in the fabric. And while you can't see that when you just look at the fabric, all fabrics look okay. But when you actually then put it on a microscope, you can see that difference. And some are pretty effective and others are, well, add practically no value at all. And even large particles that could actually pass through that. Thank you, Cas.
Cas, sorry, if I can also just ask Garth then to answer the question relating to wicking layers. Because I know with buffs and a lot of the cloth masks, even if they are 3-layered, they're often not putting wicking in them. Could you maybe explain that to everybody?
So wicking, I've learned this actually from Dr. Greg Q, is wicking is when the outer layer actually then becomes saturated. And what the wicking effect is that it, through a capillary action, a particle can actually pass through actually a liquid far easier than actually if there's a intermediate layer. And so the intent there is with the 3-layer mask is that you actually have a layer on the outside and then you have an intermediate layer. And that creates actually a separation so that you don't get a transfer of particles from the outer layer to the actually inner layer and actually being able to actually breathe those through. And that's the purpose of actually then the intermediate layer. It isn't actually a filter, it's a separation layer. Thanks.
Thank you for that. David, you've got your hand raised. You want to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that Garth's point is very important because the masks they used in that Hanoi study were 2-layered cotton masks. So this is, things have changed a lot, and I think it's important not to leave everyone with the impression that the masks, current modern masks, increase the risk to the wearer. I don't think there's been a study to show that. I mean, one has to bear it in mind and just be careful. I just bear it in mind, but certainly they were very inadequate masks that were used. And I was wondering if Mahendra couldn't tell us what the current recommendation is.
No. Mahendra, thank you. I see you've got your hand raised as well.
Yeah, thanks, Cas. I did share one of the most recent articles regarding the buffs in particular. They make mention of that. I think the Americans refer to it as a gator. And when we did the initial review and efficiency, as I think Garth was it, we agreed that there needed to be that barrier efficiency created and the layering, so that even when you became aware of the wicking effect, you would immediately take it off and then go and sanitize it and get it washed and then reuse it after a while. And with a gator or a buff, the polypropylene material that is used and the fashionable aspect of it, so it's it's easy around your neck, it's more comfortable to wear, and there's more breathability. But the actual efficiency of those buffs, they didn't meet the requirements of the textiles that we had looked at, and we. At the time, I think it was an oversight. We should have explicitly excluded them from the market, and we didn't. But we had said that the design of the mask should be that it was attached so that you could take it off at one side and you'd know where you were touching it, so that even if you did touch your face and you potentially had the virus on your fingertips, that you didn't transmit it to yourself and then breathe it with the close proximity of your hands. So yeah, so we wouldn't recommend it. In addition, I would like to add that in terms of, I saw a question there regarding the plastic visor shields, which I'm happy to share that we do have local capacity, and actually the Department of Trade and Industry is designating this product right now as 100% designated. That means that that product for the public sector specifically would have to be purchased locally because we have so much capacity. The department then also, with our division, did issue a directive saying it is worthwhile that public sector, or sorry, public facing workers, specifically in retail spaces and high traffic spaces, should then wear and consider wearing both a fabric mask and a plastic visor, so that there's now more of a barrier between the public and in a public setting. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. Let me try again to get to some of the questions we want to ask live. So I'm going to ask Pretty, you've got a question there. I've unmuted you. If you want to ask your question, please. Pretty Nyate. Okay, let me try one of the others. Vanessa. Seem to be struggling with unmuting our participants. There we go. That's Pretty. Please go ahead.
No.
Pretty, you can ask your question.
No, I think I pressed by mistake. I'm fine. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Teresa, if you've got a question. Okay, let me go back to our questions online. There's a question around, and I know it's a question that's been debated very often, the difference between the KN95 mask, FFP2 masks, and N95 masks. Any of our panelists that want to respond to that question, please?
David, you want to go, or should I take it?
Let me go, because I need to leave soon. It's a pity Janusha Singh isn't here. She's head of our immunology and microbiology department, but they're doing some very important research on these masks, and the KN95 mask failed abysmally in fit testing. There might be better products, because it's a generic name for a range of respirators, basically. They're all the same, sort of supposed to satisfy the same specifications, but they're different manufacturers, and so you get different types. The types that were tested at the NIOH by Janusha Singh failed abysmally.
Mendo, you want to add to that?
So David, yeah, we were as a department, we were very, very aligned to your thinking. And just let me start off by saying that the KN95 and N95 and FFP2 and FFP3 are names of the respirators. So they usually named from the region, and KN95s are usually from the Asian market. And as a republic, we had instructed the International Trade Administration Commission to ban those products from coming in because they had been failing in the public sector and they were being imported. The N95 is usually a US name. FFP2 and FFP3 is the European Union, which is what the South African authorities have homogenized. So in our market, we refer to the masks as the respirator masks as FFP2 and FFP3. And as I said, they were just the homogenization of the standard from the European Union. and we did send out a directive saying that the KN95 masks should not be worn and should not be purchased by any of our public sector and health worker environment because they had failed all the tests. Yeah. I do see, I have seen those masks now being distributed by one of the private sector insurance companies, PPS, I think it is, to pharmaceutical workers and pharmacy workers. And when I went to my local pharmacy, I'd seen the pharmacist there wearing it, and I'd asked her where she had got it from. She said they were being given out freely, and I think that's really a problem because they could be used then in a sterile environment, and it could cause a major health risk.
Thank you for that. Any other panelists like to add to that response? Janet?
Thank you very much, Chair. I think in addition to what Prof. and Mahendra are saying, KN95 and N95 is like the NIOH one. I mean, they should be the same according to the supplier communication and so forth. And they should be filtering at least 95% of the particle in terms of the filtration efficiency. But the FFP2 is 1% less. In other words, it filters at least 94% of the particles. But what I want to bring to the attention of colleagues on this platform is there's also N95, which are for industrial use. There's also N95 for medical use. So by virtue of having an N95 in front of you does not mean that it is intended for medical use. So that's why it has to go for further testing and get approved as a medical surgical mask or medical phased respirator and so forth. So that is the difference. And in terms of what Prof mentioned, in terms of the KN95, I have tested myself, and the fit factor that I could get, it was around 4% as opposed to, it was 4 as opposed to 100, which is a fit factor of passing a respirator which is likely to fit you. So I'm not generalizing that all KN95 are not actually providing a good fit, because like Prof said, there are a number of models and brands and so forth. So I would like to treat what I have used for fit testing as the ones that couldn't give me a proper fit, and like to generalize. Thank you.
Thank you. Mahendra, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, thanks. And just to say again, in terms of our localization efforts as the department and with our social partners, we have now enough capacity to meet the demand for FFP2 and FFP3 masks, which have passed all the tests with SAPRA licensing and NCRS and SABS, and our local capacity can meet the demand for the healthcare sector. And we would strongly advise procurement officials to please purchase from the localization efforts, because we have standardized the testing, we have ensured the efficiency and especially for the sterile environment. So there is capacity in our republic in terms of our medical PPE response.
Thank you for that. There's a number of questions around the construction industry. Somebody asked a question around wearing cloth masks on construction sites. There's a question around any advice on wearing cloth, the challenge of wearing a cloth mask and the fogging of safety spectacles. I think we've all experienced the challenge even wearing a mask with normal spectacles. Any advice on how you can prevent that? And then there's also a question around working for long hours with cloth masks, whether that have any potential health impacts or negative health impacts, or whether it could actually make one ill. Any panelists going want to have an opinion on that? Mahendra?
Just before a panelist reply, Mahendra, one moment. Could you just click the answer live button when a question is answered by a panelist live, so we can also deplete the number of questions? Thank you.
Mahendra?
Sorry, Cass, I just attended to something else. Repeat the question, please.
It was around with regards to the wearing of cloth masks on construction sites. and also the challenge when you want to wear a cloth mask and safety goggles, and whether there's any advice, how do we mitigate that factor of cloth or of goggles fogging up when wearing masks?
Yeah. So on the goggle specification, we had also localized the efforts here, and we had ensured that the specification for goggles had to, when they were being manufactured, to not fog up, because there is a specific manufacturing requirement that goggles must sustain a long time being used. In an industrial setting, such as a mining facility, if there are the other protocols being ensured, then the cloth masks was okay. It was okay to be worn. But if miners are going to be in close proximity to each other, and also the consideration that this is a environment where they're working quite hard and there is droplets on there, then there had to be the insurance that there was going to be monitoring of the mask, and miners had to be given and workers in this industrial setting had to be given by the employer quite a few replacement masks. I think at the time the unions had requested 3 every 3 months. We had not stipulated that, and we not sent out a directive on that. But I think it was communicated to workers via the unions that mine workers and workers in general should be given ample masks to replace them if they got wet during the day and if they got damaged while working. So in terms of response, yes, a cloth mask can be worn in that environment, taking into consideration the other protocols.
Any additions from any of the panelists?
Could I add something onto that? So there's some good news. The good news is that in outdoor environments, actually infection with or transmission of COVID-19 is about 20 times less likely than actually indoor environments. And it speaks to then the earlier point, which is the importance of actually ventilation. Now, in terms of actually just speaking from a risk perspective, we understand there's a requirement to actually wear masks. What that looks like is that already just the fact that you're outdoors in an outdoor environment means that it's a major risk mitigation, the fact you're outdoors. I went to the refinery a couple of months ago, and I had to spend the day actually walking around with a face shield, actually a pair of safety glasses, and actually a mask. And it was just a nightmare. And I had gained a new appreciation for just how difficult that is. And so if we also consider then, okay, so in light of that, it's extremely difficult to do that. What do we do? If we consider then dose, where dose is actually then concentration. So number one, we're actually in an outdoors environment. The second of all, actually the other component of dose is actually duration. So what that looks like in a risk environment is that if we want to reduce risk, number one, we're outdoors. Number two, if we have to be close to somebody else, then we move in and out of their presence very quickly. Now, typically what I see people do is to move close to somebody, and you may need to work close to them when you're working, but staying in that person's personal space. Now, if you then outdoors and you can move in and out of that person's space very quickly, it means that your duration or exposure to potentially infected persons is actually reduced. So all of those are actually good news stories. The other factor is that we may look at, there's actually ACE2 receptors actually in the conjunctive of the eye. And it means that one of the infection mechanisms is through actually then through the eyes. So we may look at where somebody is doesn't have to work in close proximity to somebody else, and perhaps a face shield is okay. And then there could be a rule that, let's say, that if you're in close proximity and you have to remain in that, let's say, 1.5 meters distance, that you actually have to wear actually a mask. And in a discussion earlier webinar actually with the chief inspector also alluded to the fact that we have to do what's actually reasonably practicable when actually that same question was actually asked to him. So yes, it is difficult to wear then actually a cloth mask and glasses and actually a face shield all in conjunction with each other. But I think that my take home for this is that we need to think about what's actually then, consider all the aspects of risk. Consider then also another factor is that when you look at the contribution of actually droplet isn't in fact the the main transmission source. We're talking about not for coughing or sneezing, we're talking about breathing. And that from about 200 millimeters away from the face, actually breath and actually aerosols are actually the main transmission mechanism. So again, we can actually use that to say, well, it's more important in terms of risk contribution to make sure that we actually in an outdoor environment, that if we're in an indoor environment, that we actually then reducing actually concentration of actually virus through actually air changes. Thank you.
Thank you. Getting back to the initial question posed with regards to the challenge between compatibility between masks and safety glasses or normal spectacles. Any practical advice from our panel members how you can actually counter that, Sean?
Sorry, I actually, do you mind if I just maybe weigh in on the earlier one as well? We're picking up anecdotally out in construction, particularly on asbestos sites where the guys are using cloth masks instead of the FFP2 masks in terms of the work. So there's actually dust exposure occurring as well. So that's something interesting to note. And I suppose with all the colleagues and that are out there in the field, just be aware of that sort of thing happens. And then obviously the use of masks is a problem, and the risk assessment should be the thing that informs exactly how it should work. And what Garth also alluded to was the fact that outdoor work is well ventilated. So you can actually orientate the work relative to prevailing wind. You can obviously ventilate an area mechanically as well. And I think to me, the most important thing is that it's only when you start actually ticking the boxes of proximity, duration, and poor ventilation where you actually have to start implementing masks. I've been onto a lot of sites where people are kind of working with very, very good distancing space and good ventilation. So they're obviously further away than 1.5 meters, 2 meters or 3 meters, yet they are still being instructed to wear these masks. So again, it's actually looking at the policy, actually knowing the regulations and understanding how to apply all these different layers to a situation so that you can actually use the best available technique to protect each other and your guys. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean. Much appreciated. Mahendra, I see your hand is raised. Do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, there's just some communication going on in the chat box, so maybe I should just address it here. I think Jill Murray's question regarding the FFP and our localization efforts. As a republic, we have ramped up our localization efforts and to most all of the medical products that is required in response to COVID-19. I will say on this platform that there is in development a huge capacity to respond to most all of the needs. And FFP2 and FFP3, we have sourced the local raw materials. We are also looking at the potential of the circularity of those products going back into the value chain, so that if the legislation changes and that the recycling of those masks that they are worn, if they can be decontaminated, and there's an investigation into that. There is, to Joel's comment there, the activities were ramped up. We have local manufacturers who are being able to manufacture these masks that are passing the test. The reason why we haven't given a directive for the general public to use these masks is that currently they meet the demand of the healthcare sector. And if and when we do have a second surge of a COVID-19 infection, as we enter winter again next year potentially, then we don't want to have a rush to these masks and have a market shortage again. So the fabric face masks do not need to be substituted in our position, as we have indicated during this call, that it's most likely still the best option right now for the general public. David's comments were to wearability, for longevity of the wearer, using it during an activity, and a better functionality. I also think that if there is masks being sold, an FFP2 mask, FFP3 mask, you should purchase it and wear it, but I would say there is no need to replace a directive and say that we should now go and swap to FFP3 and FFP2 masks, while we've shown that the cloth masks do provide the barrier efficiency that is required for the general public. Thank you.
Thank you for that response. I've got a question that I picked up here in the box, and I think there's a topic developing here around a few issues. let me, Johan, to see maybe Prof. Johan, if I can question or forward the question to you, or maybe Janet, and it's around whether wearing of mask can actually make you ill. So there's a question from Natalie February that's asking whether mask acne has become a thing. People are getting breakouts on their face from extended use of masks. Any advice how to avoid or mitigate this risk? And there's also a question that was more direct in terms of, does a mask wearing actually do have potential to make you ill? Just scrolling through the inbox here. So maybe if you can handle that one, Prof. Johan, and then maybe Janet and any other panel members who's got the opinion around the general topic of wearing masks making someone ill, or some dermal issues. Thank you, Johan.
Thank you, Gus. I think in terms of the whole concept of whether a mask will make you ill, I think there will be some factors related to the type of mask that one is wearing, especially when it comes down to cloth masks. But I think there's various examples of videos that I've seen on social media of coming from our medical professionals showing that they are wearing, and in their case, many cases, surgical masks and other respirators with blood oxygen levels, etc. And it really doesn't show that they are becoming ill. So I think, yeah, one needs to be careful in terms of, it's again trying to compare a cloth mask with a surgical mask or specialized respiratory protective equipment. But I think in general, it is not supposed to make one ill in terms of the levels of oxygen, the levels of carbon dioxide exhaled, etc. So in that regard, I don't think there's too much of an issue coming from that. With regard to the dermal effects, I think what happens is when you wear a mask for an extended period of time, you end up basically occluding your skin, especially around those parts of the face that are covered. And the best advice for that would be then to, when you remove your mask, and just be careful to sanitize, etc., but to really wash your face and that covered areas as well with warm water and soap, opening up the pores, etc. And I think that will help. There has been quite a few papers published on skin effects related to the wearing of masks. I've seen quite a few papers in the healthcare sector, so there is some skin issues there. But I think for the general public, it would be the recommendation to just try and properly wash your skin after wearing a mask for an extended period of time. Thank you.
Johan, there's a question, a follow-up question from Werner Vinnie, and the question reads, may I ask as to why many people are reporting dizziness, dry throat, and headaches after a few hours of continuing a cloth mask being worn? What might be the cause of this? Any response or thoughts from your idea, Johan?
It will probably be a little bit of carbon dioxide. Yeah, and I think it's maybe due to having an increased breathing resistance through the cloth mask and wearing it for an extended period of time. I think that's my answer in short.
Thank you. Thank you, Johan. Any other panel members that want to add to that response from Prof. Johan? No, nothing specific. Again, I think this question probably also, Johan, you can respond to that for us. The question is, how safe it is to wear a mask whilst jogging? I think we touched on it earlier with the response to the question around fitness facilities and so forth. But I think from a physiological perspective, Prof. Du Plessis, is it safe to jog with a mask, or to run with a mask, or even exercise with a mask?
Yeah, my opinion, and I mean, I'm not the most active person, but when I go out to exercise, I've been on the bike with a mask and without a mask. I think the preference would be to do it without a mask. But yeah, I think it can be a hindrance in many instances, but yet again, it comes down to the type of face covering or mask that one uses, and the amount of breathing resistance when you exhale, whether that material as such is such a tightly woven face covering with a tight seal around the face that it may you may end up with some carbon dioxide building up, and so yeah, I think it's a very subjective person-to-person experience as well that comes to the fore. I think some of the other presenters earlier alluded to it. I think you need to have a look at your surroundings and do your own little risk assessment for where you find yourself. If you go to a gym to assess the environment in which you are, whether, I mean, if the ventilation is absolutely perfect, then one can then consider getting rid of the mask. But when it's becoming stuffy as Garth said, I think then one needs to be a little bit more cautious. So,
thank you, Dr. Plessis. There's a number of questions again in the chat box, and I think we've touched on it.
Could I add just something onto Johan's actually answer in terms of the question on masks and exercising? Perhaps it's the wrong question. I know it's partly the right question, but I think that there's an element to it, again, considering then what the relative contribution in terms of safety is of the mask. And there was the one is actually the plume effect, is that when you're actually then walking or running, actually what's probably more important is actually social distancing. And if you're walking fast, actually then we should be keeping a social distancing of up to 10 meters. And there's a German study which then looked at when you're running, you should be keeping a social distance of up to 20 meters. And so if we consider then walking or running or jogging outside as a form of defensive driving, and what I do is that when I'm actually walking actually then or jogging, actually I look and actually then if I see somebody coming down the road, and there's enough space, and I look for cars, whatever, hopefully a quiet road, I then switch to the other side of the road. And that social distancing is a far more important and actually powerful barrier in terms of relative reduction of risk than actually then wearing the mask. And so the wearing the mask, yes, it is a factor, but it's certainly far less important than the distance we keep between each other. And I think that's probably where the more important risk focus should be. Thank you.
I fully agree with you, Garth, and I've answered a question earlier on the chat box as well that pertained to the same question around workplaces and so forth. And I've seen a number of companies that actually only requires wearing of masks in the workplace in situations where you cannot actually practice social distancing. Now, I know it's not always possible when you're doing certain tasks or when people need to work very closely together, but where it's possible to apply social distancing in the workplace, then the mask issue actually becomes secondary. I fully agree with that one. Let me see. There's a general question around as well in terms of yeah, let me get back to the wealth. Sorry, that was where I were before I responded to Garth's request. There's a general question around valve masks, whether valve masks should be allowed or whether it shouldn't be allowed. And that the questions range from questions around workplaces with regards to gyms, but also in the general public. And we see them being quite popular. Can one of the panelists maybe take up the question for us by starting with an explanation of why valve masks are deemed to be a risk product, if I can call it that, the science behind that, and then maybe if we can start working towards just looking at the time here on taking some of this forward. We will respond to all the questions we can't get to, but I do think it's important that we have a discussion specifically around valve masks and the use of valve masks in the public domain and the public in general. So maybe if one of the task members or the panel members specifically, maybe I'm looking at your valve or even you, Sean, what's the issue around valve masks? Why is it a problem? Or is it a problem? And what do we do in taking this forward? Sean, thanks for that.
Thanks, Cas. Yeah, I've also been looking through the Q&A, and this is an incredibly common theme throughout the session. And thank you all for asking the question. The valve masks is certainly an issue. I've been looking at it for a while. I've actually been pretty vehemently opposed to it because the devices, when you look at a valve mask, you get them in the FFP2, P3, P1 ranges as well. So that's respiratory protection. So when you're wearing respiratory protection in a course of work and you're exposed to a contaminant like a dust, what you want to do is not breathe that dust in. So what a valve actually has is it's a one-way valve. So what it does is it allows easy breathing. And if you're working with a device like this on, so you've got a metabolic demand as well. What's nice to have is actually a valve so that you're actually working with the contaminants. And so what it's doing is that when you're breathing in, it's actually filtering the air out. So it's bypassing the valve and it's going through the mask filter. However, when you exhale, what happens instead of it going through the sides of the mask and all the other leak points, what it'll do is it'll actually, the exhalation, the warm exhalation that contains moisture and that will go out through the valve and into the open area. So what is the principal reason around COVID? So what it is that as human beings, we are now the source of the disease. So a valve mask is protecting you from another source, a contaminant source, like a grain silo, or you're doing construction work, asbestos work, whatever it is. So that is the source of exposure. However, when you actually are wearing a mask, you are the one that is actually there to stop the contaminants from actually reaching other people. So it's an altruistic thing, as David says. So if you've got a valve on and when you exhale, that exhalation is going out through the valve. So it's containing all the droplets, the moisture and everything else in there, so and including the virus itself. So if you cough, forcefully breathe, talk, or whatever it is through the valve, it will certainly actually spread and be transmitted through that. And again, I use my candle demonstration as well, which I've done before, is that if you put a valve mask on and you put the candle by the valve and you blow out, you just blow the candle out. So yeah, fails that test. I'm sure the colleagues have got more to put on the subject, so I'll end there. Thank you.
Any additions from the panel members on the question, and what do we actually, how do we take it forward? Maybe Mahendra, you've got some ideas actually around valves. Do we actually prohibit them? Do we provide additional advice or guidance to the public? What's the next step for that one?
Thanks, Cass. Picking up from what Garth said, I would like to support the National Institute of Occupational Health picking this up and do support the current research that says that this valve masks are not appropriate for general public use. To highlight further that the FFP2, the respirators with these valves, are usually to be worn on a once-off basis and discarded because they're worn in sterile environments. So when you use a cloth mask, it's meant to be used for, in terms of the DTI's guide, at least 100 washes, and we had specified that they had to be used with non-toxic materials. So regarding the previous question on whether these masks can cause allergic reactions or any other health risks. And then also those plastic valves, they do have, I've seen some of them with these like little filtration inserts in it, and that would not withstand washes and then be efficient. So I think they would then be not a reusable mask. If they do have these valves, they would have to be discarded. And the Center for Disease Control in the United States, they've just issued a circular, as I mentioned earlier, at the end of August, that had said that these masks should not be worn at all in public. So it would be really grateful and actually a good burden taken off from us as the department to issue this. And it will be, I would support the NIOH to issue a statement saying that these valves and any kind of decorative fabric masks that reduce the efficiency of the mask to not be used and not circulated within the market. Thank you.
Gus, perhaps just to add something onto that. So if it were an inhalation valve, it would place the user at risk. And if it were an exhalation valve, it would actually place others at risk. And it's even been said that the valve may actually create a jet effect, where you get then the full volume of air actually breathed out, actually breathing out in a particular direction. So no matter which way the mask actually then, or the valve actually then is actually used, it's just bad news. So I think there's a very clear and decisive answer from the scientific community, actually for, in totality, 100%, everybody says no valves.
Perfect. I think there's a number of manufacturers, suppliers of these masks that might not agree with that statement, but that is true. I'm going to hand back to you, Ashraf. I'm just looking at the time here. I think we've got a few minutes left. So I think, unfortunately, we need to stop the question and answer session here. I see there's still a number of open questions. The panelists will respond to your question, and we will get back to those that we were not able to get to in this live chat. But I would like to thank everybody for their participation and the questions posed. I think it was a really live discussion on a very controversial topic. So let me hand over back to you, Ashraf. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's Professor Cas Badenhorst, Group Lead Occupational Health at Anglo American PLC, that chaired our Q&A session there. I'm going to just ask our panelists if they could have a look at the Q&A box and see which of those questions there's quite a number, so they could just tackle in the next 5 to 10 minutes. That might take us a few minutes beyond our closing time. That will be very much appreciated. So Mr. Garth Hunter, Professor Jan du Plessis, Professor David Rees, Mr. Sean Chester, Mr. Mahendra Shumugan, and Dr. Greg Q, if you could just look at those questions there as well. For those who have asked questions, unfortunately in the chat box and not in the Q&A box, we encourage you please to, if you still want to follow up on your question, email that to info, that is info.nih.ac.za. And please clearly identify the webinar as well as the presenter or topic, and we could then direct that via Prof. Badenhorst's team to get an answer to you. But if you could shift it to the Q&A section, they could possibly still answer it. And if there's been a theme, clearly your question would have been covered by one of those thematic responses. So at this point, I need to say thank you very much to, firstly, my colleague Jeanette Mangani, the head of the section, that's the occupational hygiene section here at the NIOH, as well as her team member, that's Mr. Norman Koza, who's the occupational hygiene professional that's associated with the program officer, a senior program officer for occupational health and safety specialist at the African Union Development Agency, New Partnership for African Development, and that's NEPAD. So thank you for organizing the significantly well-qualified specialists as presenters as well as panelists. And I think that interactive process chaired by Professor Badenhorst was quite excellent in dealing with some of the hot topics, as one of our attendees indicated. And then just as a matter of thanks for the record to Professor David Rees, Head of Occupational Medicine and Epidemiology at the National Institute for Occupational Health. That is the contribution he made on the topic of wearing masks. First we didn't, now we do. What changed? And that was a very useful look at both the research and the general suggestions being made by people, where the ongoing research is probably going to inform us more. And then to Mr. Mahendra Shanmugam from the Department of Trade and Industry and Competition, that's the DTIC. He's the Director of Policy Implementation and Development there, on the topic recommended guidelines for fabric face masks in South Africa, the function, properties, and general use guide. And that was quite interesting to hear how the qualities of the fabric, etc., and as well as this issue of the valve quite a controversial one, and a number of attendees have asked questions with regard to that. And then finally to you again, Professor Badenhorst, for chairing on behalf of the South African Institute for Occupational Hygiene in partnership with the NIOH. And so again, I need to remind all of our attendees, please, it is critical for you to visit the NIOH's website, that is www.nih.ac.za, www.nih.ac.za. It is a zero-rated website. All of our webinars, both in video and audio format, is made available to you, and all presentations are posted there of all the presenters that have contributed to approximately 48 webinars we've undertaken, attended by almost 31,000 attendees. And then we have a Twitter handle, and as we end this particular session in a minute or so, the Twitter handle will also be in the slides that will be showing on the screen. We have the hotline, and that is the NIOH's hotline. The number is 0800-212-175, and this is particularly for workplace specific questions and queries you might have. It is the personnel and staff there is from our occupational medicine section, and we encourage you to use that hotline only for very specific urgent questions you have. Otherwise, use the email address that is info@nih.ac.za, so that it can be directed to the specific presenters, for example, of today's webinars, and to other specialists within our many different sections here: occupational medicine, occupational hygiene, immunology and microbiology, and then toxicology and biochemistry, etc. In terms of the questions. The links to the presentations are also emailed to all of you, that will take you to the website as well. For those who are interested only in the attendance certificate, those attendance certificates will be generally emailed to everybody. But those who are interested in the CPD certification or CPD accredited, particularly Health Professional Council South Africa, South African Institute for Occupational Hygiene, and other specific bodies that has already accredited these webinars, that link and password will be sent to you within a within a few hours after the session is completed, and you can then do the online class marker test in order to secure the CPD certificate of attendance for this particular session. We have reached the end of our session, and again, on behalf of the head of the Occupational Health COVID-19 Outbreak Response Team, Dr. Tanusha Singh, as well as Jeanette Manganye, who was the lead coordinator and organizer for this particular webinar in partnership with the South African Institute for Occupational Health. Thanks again to Dr. Norman Koza, to Mr. Norman Koza and Professor Badenhorst for their contributions to this webinar. Thank you very much for those panelists who are answering some of the questions there. It is reducing significantly. For those attendees who are adding more questions, please, if your question is not answered, also direct your question to info@nih.ac.za, and the panelist team will address that there. We may hopefully complete all of the questions. There's approximately 17 left before we shut down the actual webinar. Thank you for joining us, to all the presenters, to all the panelists, to the whole of the NIOH team organizing this particular webinar, and the members of the SAIOH team who has contributed to this collaborative event. Thank you very much. On behalf of the National Institute for Occupational Health and our director, Dr. Spoor Galamono, we say thank you and goodbye.
Take care. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mahendra. Thank you to the other panelists.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
you.